me. Okay, here we go. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. This is going to be fun. We're here today to talk about everyone's favorite beverage, nearly everyone's favorite beverage. It's the second most consumed beverage in the world, coffee. Most of us drink the stuff, but few of us know how it gets into our cups. And so that's the idea of today. I want to tell you about how the coffee bean, which is actually a seed, gets into our coffee cups so that the next time you drink coffee, it might taste a little bit sweeter or seem like a little more of a miracle. So thank you for joining me today, baristas. I am joining you from Guatemala, but before Guatemala, I lived in Brazil, which is a great place to talk about coffee. Brazil is the #1 producer of coffee. Today, we're going to focus on 3 main regions. There are 3 main coffee growing regions, I guess, depending on how you categorize it. But today, we're mainly going to focus on the Americas. So as I say that, I show you a picture of Kenya. This is a coffee flowering from Kenya. Now, if you've ever been to a coffee farm, lucky you. If you've ever been to a coffee farm while the flowering is happening, double lucky you. So the flower is a beautiful time, and it makes farmers very excited because a flowering is required to then have fruit, and coffee comes from the fruit of the coffee tree. And coffee flowerings smell exquisite. I guess if you're familiar maybe with what jasmine smells like, you could compare a coffee flowering maybe to that sort of scent. But this is about the time that farmers start getting very excited. After that flowering, you end up with the fruit. And at first, this fruit, if you can see at the top of the picture, is green. So they're called cherries, coffee cherries. So the fruit starts out green and hard and starts to fill up the whole branch. Then after that, they ripen. And this is over the course of many months. This right here, you can see these are ripe coffee cherries. You could actually pick it off of the tree and put it in your mouth. There's a tiny bit of pulp, of actual fruit. Think like when you bite into a grape, there's fruit there, but there would be much less than what you would have in a grape. So you can taste there's a tiny bit of fruit on the outside of the hard seed, the coffee bean. And it's a little bit sweet. So these are ripe cherries. So we generally say when they're red, they're ripe, right? But check it out. Is this ripe? This is ripe as well. This is a yellow variety of catuai in the Dominican Republic. So you can have yellow ripes depending on the variety, just like you can have different colors of tomatoes, right? You might have the red tomatoes are the most common, just like the red cherries are the most common, but you can also have other varieties of tomatoes. You can have yellow, you can have purple, this sort of thing. So this is a ripe yellow catuai from the Dominican Republic. Now that's a bit about the process on the tree, but I want to talk a little bit about planting, because the way coffee is planted varies drastically across coffee regions. So Brazil is very famous for row planting, and you can see, look at all of the coffee trees lined up. You can see the rows in this picture. And the reason they can do that is because in a lot of coffee growing regions in Brazil, it's very flat. If any of you all have been to other parts of Latin America, say the Dominican Republic, say Guatemala, say Costa Rica, a lot of coffee is grown up in the mountains on very steep hillsides. And so row planting would not be as practical. Why? It's more work to get them into rows. And the reason they do this in Brazil is because they also use technology to pick. They do mechanical picking. This is a picture of a bunch of huge mechanical pickers that you can run through those rows when it comes time for harvest, which is obviously a lot less labor than doing it by hand. And in Brazil, labor costs, paying people to pick the coffee is quite expensive. So at that point, it becomes advantageous to adapt your whole planting and harvesting system to be able to mechanize it. This is in contrast to what you might see in something like Central America. You have coffee scattered, you can't see any rows here. You have a wide variety of species scattered throughout the hills. It would be nearly impossible to run those huge mechanical pickers over this sort of landscape. So what do? Often they have what are called selective hand pickings. So whereas with mechanical picking, you might go through, take it all off the tree, and then use different technologies to sort which ones are perfectly ripe, which ones are overripe, which ones are underripe. Here, with when you have actual people, they can go through. It still takes more time, but they can go through and pick the ripe cherries. This is a beautiful picking right here. Just the ripe cherries, and then let the other ones stay on the plant and continue ripening and go back and pick them again. In some harvests, you might do this 3 or 4 times. And it's really only tenable where labor costs are affordable. After you get the coffee off the trees, you have to decide what to do with it. And this varies according to local circumstances as well, just as the way you plant and the way you pick is contingent upon local circumstances and landscapes and economies, so is the way you dry it. When the coffee comes off of the tree, we have to find a way to get that fruit off efficiently. We're trying to get down to the seed. It's the seed that we're then going to package up and sell to someone who will roast it, grind it, and put it in your cup. So in Brazil, since often they do not hand pick, they have to have smart ways of separating the different types of ripeness. And we'll look at how that happens. One way of getting the fruit off is by not getting the fruit off at first. So just taking the ripe coffee off the trees and putting it straight on the patio. This is called natural process. And it can change the way the coffee tastes at the end because it's drying with the fruit on rather than the fruit off. And so that fruit gives it certain types of flavors. It's so dark here because those red cherries, when they start fermenting in the drying process, just out on the patio, not a bad fermentation, but when they start drying, they turn darker colored. So we can take the ripes and we can put them straight on the patio. The other thing we can do, which is the way most coffee is processed in Brazil, natural process. The other thing that we would do before we even get to that step is to run all the coffee through the wet mill. This is a really extensive wet mill setup. And I'm sure you're looking at it and you're like, I don't even know where to look. There's lots of things happening here. So with a wet mill, what you're going to do, you're going to have a place that receives, which you can't see very well here, but where you put the cherries in after they've come off the tree. And then you'll use water because different ripeness levels have different densities, you can use water to separate them. So the overripes, the ones that are too ripe, end up floating. They're called floaters. The ripes float as well. And then the underripes sink because they're denser and they do not float in water. So now we've separated the ripes and overripes from the underripes. We have two streams going. Then you can send the ripes and overripes through a depulper with different pressure, and it will get the fruit off of those seeds, off of the coffee bean. So there's all sorts of ways to separate things in the wet mill, but that's basically what's happening in a wet mill is you're trying to separate out different ripeness levels and thus usually different quality levels. And then sometimes in a wet mill, you're also trying to get an amount of the coffee fruit off, which is also called the pulp. Contrast what you just saw here, this setup, which costs, I don't know how many dollars, with a hand-driven wet mill. So this is doing the same thing. This is a depulper. This is the whole wet mill setup. So that is Byron. That's my husband. He's put the coffee in there by hand, and then he's turning the depulper. And the depulper is putting pressure against those cherries and almost scraping the fruit off of the bean so that it can get down closer to the seed and thus begin to dry better and faster. And he has to add water in himself to keep it going. Another part of the wet mill process are the fermentation tanks. So if you're going to we talked about natural process coffee, which is just leave the fruit on and put it on the patio and call it a day. Washed process, which is many coffee shops with, washed coffees are very prized because they're very clean tasting and stable. A lot of people like them for their espresso blends. Part of that process is some amount of fermentation. These are fermentation tanks in Kenya. So what you would do is you would take your coffee cherries and you put them in water to start to soften all of that fruit to make it easier than to just wash off. You don't have to have a machine to get it off. You can use the power of water and fermentation to start removing that fruit. You can imagine if you put fruit in water for 2 days, when you came back, it would start to disintegrate. And so that's a common thing that's done in Kenya and other parts of the world. Then after that, you'd send that fermented coffee through these washing channels, scrub the rest of the fruit off before the coffee goes to the patio. This is an example, another from Brazil, of pulped natural. So pulped natural is very similar to, in Central America, what you might hear as referred to as honeyed coffees. It's where they've taken an amount of the fruit off, some or maybe even almost all of the pulp off, and put it on the patio. And that's why it has such a lighter color here than what you saw when you saw the picture of the natural coffees that were almost black. What you're seeing there is basically the parchment. So after you get the fruit off, you end up with a layer of parchment before you can get down to the bean. And the parchment kind of helps protect the coffee. So it's left on while it's drying down to its correct humidity percentage. And then there'll be a machine to take that off. When it's on the patio, again, coffee is so labor intensive. Someone has to be out there turning the coffee so that it doesn't over ferment while it's drying, and so that it dries faster and farmers can get it off the patio faster. That, and we'll wrap up here with drying. I think that's as far as we can get, and then we'll take a break and reconvene for the second part. But when it's on the patio, getting coffee from that last 17% humidity down to 11.5 can be harder. It takes more time. It's very dependent on weather conditions. If you have a lot of volume coming off of your trees, your patio can't hold all of the coffee. And so then what do you do with it to not lose it? And that's where mechanical dryers can really come in handy. So these are round mechanical dryers at a farm in Brazil. Contrast that with these are raised drying beds in Kenya, which is a common technique used in Kenya and is good for the type of, it's less investment up front, and it's good for the type of weather conditions that you might see in Kenya. So let's pause there. Thank you all for your attention. That's the first. I wanted to take you at least through getting the coffee off the tree all the way down to the drying process. And hopefully with that, you have a better understanding of the huge amount of labor and variability that goes into getting all of these wonderful different types of coffees behind your bar so that you can prepare them as you so beautifully do for all the customers that come in your shops. And we're always very grateful for your attention to detail in shops as the last part of this chain that gets coffee from us all the way into the mouths of people who can enjoy it.